Hi everybody, welcome to Musical Fridays at the Church of the Holy Trinity. I'm Cleve Kersh, the music director. So this coming Sunday, October 25, the choir is singing an anthem by Ned Rorem. It's a setting of the psalm that has to do with how good and how pleasant it is that brethren dwell together in unity. So you can look forward to hearing that on Sunday. It's a really beautiful piece. It's got a melody and harmonies that are somewhat reminiscent of Stephen Sondheim, if you will. Not the kind of active, spiky Stephen Sondheim, but the more contemplative sort. So it'll definitely be something to listen for. I thought I'd talk a little about Ned Rorem today. American composer, born in 1923. He's still with us, so he's, coming up on 97 or 98. So a little perspective on his place in history. In 1923, that was about the time that Aaron Copland, who's considered the father of 20th century American music, as distinct from European music, that's about the time that Aaron Copland was getting his start. He had in fact studied in France, and he was coming back from studying with the famous pedagogue Nadia Boulanger near Paris, where incidentally, I guess 20 or so years later, Ned Rorem would also study. She exerted a great influence over many American composers and musicians, among them several teachers of mine. So that was about the time Copland was getting his start. So in the late 40s, when Rorem was finally of age to put pen to paper and start his own compositions, in the late 40s, quite a bit had happened in American music already. It had gone through its own extremely spiky period of dissonance and all sorts of experimentation, although that was to continue for some time as well. Copland had also set the tone for this very kind of open, expansive American sound. I don't want to call it neo-romantic exactly, or even neoclassical, but it was a uniquely American sound. It wasn't afraid of dissonance, but it primarily was concerned with, I would say, lyrical melodies and big open harmonies. So Rorem, I would say, followed that path, although he has not shied away from some of the more spiky kinds of things. I'm going to play you just the opening measures of one of his organ pieces, just to give you the understanding that he was not immune to the spiky sort of things. So he definitely had that kind of thing in his repertoire. But he's these days he's known as the godfather of American art song. He has composed, in addition to many other things, symphonies, chamber works, piano works, organ works, which I'll talk about in a moment, lots of choral music, but really his main thing has been art song. He's composed hundreds of songs. And why he was attracted to this particular genre, there's lots of reasons for that. He also is known as a writer, so sometime in the 60s, or let's see, I guess sometime in the 80s, he started to publish his diaries, which he had been writing since the 50s and 60s. You can look those up. I don't particularly need to talk about those, but they are fascinating literary documents. So he has stood just as much as a writer on his own merits as he has as a composer. But in any case, there's an unusual attraction to the written word, so it makes sense that he would want to set words, set poetry to music. As I mentioned before, overwhelmingly his style has been this kind of expansive American harmonies sort of thing, but lyrical. So what do we mean by lyrical? Generally that refers to something which is fairly easily singable. So for instance, let me play a little of the piece I'm going to do in a moment. I'm just going to play the melody for you first, to give an example of lyricism. that's what I would call a nice four-square melody. It's 8 measures long, with 2 good halves of 4 measures apiece. The whole melody is really based around what we call an E major triad. That is the basic building notes of harmony. Most of the melody concerns itself with that. Rorem takes a little edge at the beginning of the second half and introduces a note which we might not necessarily have thought of. So he could have done this. But instead he went, so instead of taking one of the normal parts of the harmony, he took the 7th degree of the scale there and added a little, it's a little tinge in a way, right? So if I now combine this with the harmony, you're going to hear how it's almost as important as the shape of the melody itself is the harmony that underlies it and how that influences how we hear it. So you've now heard just the melody. See what it's like with the harmony. Back up in a fairly consonant place, but somewhere along the middle you heard that some interesting things were being introduced. Hear those little clashes here and there. That's what keeps things interesting, of course. This is actually, it appears, a melody that Rorem originally intended to be for an art song. He said he wrote it during his student years in Paris, and then years later resurrected it for this. This particular piece is from a collection by Rorem called A Quaker Reader. Now, Rorem, his family was Quaker by choice. This is because a relative of his was, I believe, killed in the First World War, and his parents sought some sort of religious faith that was kind of entirely about peace. They weren't so concerned with the pomp of liturgy and so forth, so they found the Society of Friends. And this was somewhere in the Midwest. But Rorem himself says that was not a big part of his upbringing. It's not like they actually all the time went to meetings and practiced these tenets of silence and so forth. His parents gave him many cultural opportunities. They went to all sorts of concerts and plays and so forth when he was growing up. So by the time he was introduced to music, he had a pretty rich storehouse. But later in life, he took these Quaker tenets as more of an intellectual understanding of things. So this Quaker Reader, it's a fascinating collection of little quotes from different Quaker writings across time, and his musical reflections on them. So this particular one is called "There is a Spirit which delights to do no evil." That's a quote from a man named James Naylor in 1660, who presumably was a Quaker, and these were his dying words. There is a spirit which delights to do no evil. It's a pretty fascinating thought, actually. That's an interesting way of defining a god or a deity or just a spirit, some sort of spiritual phenomenon. So with that in mind, let me play you this piece. I want to add a little more explanation of it. So you've heard the melody now. You've heard the harmony that underlies it. This piece is constructed, I would say, in 4 sections. You have this introduction or exposition of the melody. Then you have a second reading of the melody, but this time the melody is put in canon with itself. So it starts in one voice, and then 2 beats later, the exact thing is repeated in a different voice. So let me just demonstrate that. section where the melody is put into a lower voice. And then for the final section, we come back to this canon idea. This time the melody starts in the left hand and is imitated by the right hand. So without further ado, here is There Is a Spirit Which Delights to Do No Evil by Ned Rorem. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thank you.